Good afternoon, everyone. I'm calling from the UK, and good morning to those of you who are calling in from the Americas, and of course, good evening for the participants who are calling in from Asia. I'm very honored to be here today. My name is Bonnie Ling, and I'm a human rights researcher, a business and human rights practitioner. I'm here today to help launch the Equidem report, Broken Promises, Forced Labor in Saudi Arabia, and the Fast-Tracked World Cup Bid 2024. I was here 2 years ago in 2022 to help Equidem launch its report, then of discrimination and exploitation of migrant construction workers of FIFA World Cup Qatar stadium sites. So we're here again today, 2 years later, to launch another report associated with the World Cup, but this time in 2034. I'm joined today by representatives from the Building and Woodworkers International, by ALQST, and also by the Equidem research team. So before we start, some housekeeping issues. You probably already see it in the chat box that you can choose to listen to today's report launch in Arabic. We do have that interpretation available. So click on the interpretation icon where you can select your preferred mode of listening. We also have a wonderful team of people in the background helping to troubleshoot. And you can reach them directly also through the chat box, and they will help you resolve any technical issues. But without further ado, for the next hour, we'll be going through the findings of this report, Broken Promise, and why it matters. We will also listen to a panel discussion, and we will take your questions, and hopefully we can wrap things up in an hour. But this means it's going to be very tight, and my job is to help the team bring to you the findings of this report. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Mustafa Qadri, the CEO of Equidem. Mustafa, over to you. Why is this such an important report 10 years before we're even looking at the kickoff of 2034 World Cup?
Thank you, Bonnie, and thank you to everyone for joining us today on this really important topic that is the subject of our report. Well, Bonnie, you ask a really key question, and in many ways, the answer to that is obvious, but I still think it's worth us spending a moment to think about it, the situation that we're in right now. Because from all corners of the earth, capital is pouring into the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Seeking to diversify, the oil-rich nation has been bullish on growing its tech industry and establishing itself as the go-to spot for splashy international events and tourism. For example, at a glitzy conference in March, Amazon announced a $5.3 billion investment in the kingdom for data centers and artificial intelligence technology. The largest hotel construction activity in the Middle East is happening in Saudi Arabia. The Saudi Public Investment Fund is in talks with the Professional Golfers Association Tour, and its sports fund recently put $100 million.
لاعبي الجولف المحترفين، وقد وضع صندوق الرياضة مؤخرا $100 مليون في دائرة فنون القتال المختلطة. سرعت الفيفا الهيئة الحاكمة أو الضابطة لكرة القدم الدولية عمل.
And the World Cup announcement, along with its $100 billion fund to invest in AI and other technology, may mark Saudi Arabia's coronation as the world's boom town. But eager multinationals should proceed with caution. Saudi Arabia's dismal human rights record, including when it comes to labor rights, make the kingdom a risky and unstable investment and base of operations. Businesses that invest in Saudi Arabia are actively complicit in the country's human rights abuses and could be the driving force for further violations. Of course, sadly, there are many examples of questionable investing in countries despite their human rights records, like the world's best-known fashion retailers implicated with suppliers involved in Uyghur forced labor, with brands pressured to cut ties with suppliers and end all sourcing from the Xinjiang region of China. Or in an example of employers pushing for leadership to live up to its brand promises, Google being forced to shut down Dragonfly, its censored search app for China, after employers partnered with rights organizations to stop the project. Not to mention the decades-long international condemnation, legal suits, and loss of investor confidence, as in the case of Shell operations in the Niger Delta, including the execution of environmental activist Ken Saro-Wiwa in 1995, and the ongoing activism of his family against Shell. And of course, we've seen in the last few months a broad global coalition from students to international jurists who have called for an end to investments in arms and other business fueling international crimes, including apartheid and potentially even genocide by Israel in the occupied Palestinian territories. The report we are launching today makes for difficult reading. It is the product of incredibly brave and careful investigations by migrant workers in Saudi Arabia itself, with the support of expert colleagues from across the world. The report raises a simple question. How on earth could FIFA seriously consider Saudi Arabia as a host for its marquee event, given its human rights record? Or partner with Saudi Aramco, the world's largest oil and gas company, given its role in climate change after so many years of consultation with human rights experts and exposure of scandal after scandal? In-depth, confidential, one-to-one interviews with dozens of migrant workers conducted by Equidem have documented significant labor and human rights violations, showing a pattern of legal exclusion, discrimination, exploitation, and suppression of freedom of association in Saudi Arabia. A different path is possible. Saudi Arabia must be required to demonstrate compliance with international human rights and labor rights standards. These standards are not just the international standards for human rights worldwide. They are a path to a better society in Saudi Arabia, where all people can live a life of dignity, freedom, and prosperity, regardless of their gender, race, beliefs, or sexuality. It is that same belief that unites all of us today, including the speakers on our panel. Equidem's team of worker and community investigators, experts, and advocates will continue to monitor the situation in Saudi Arabia, as we do across the globe, to expose injustice, provide solutions, and build a better human rights movement. Thank you again for joining us today. I'll now hand back to you, Bonnie.
Thank you, Mustafa, for that overview, for making the business and human rights case for why it matters, why we're launching this report today, 10 years before we're looking at the World Cup 2034. I was very struck as I read your report, which is available for all participants to download from the Equidem website. You speak of these, testimonies of workers speaking at great risk of loss of their livelihood. And with that in mind, I would like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Shikha Silliman Bhattacharjee, who led the research design for this report and who will give all of us a brief overview of the main findings. Over to you, Shikha. Shikha, you're still on mute. Can you please unmute? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bonnie. So thank you everyone for being on the call today and for joining us for the launch of our report, Broken Promises, Forced Labor in Saudi Arabia and the Fast-Tracked World Cup Bid. In the next 10 minutes, I'll first situate this research in context, share our findings, and provide a high-level overview of where we can go from here. At its core, this research addresses 3 issues. Slide. First, the dangers associated with FIFA setting forward a commitment to human rights due diligence without taking measures to implement this commitment. In other words, we are concerned with the arbiter of international football breaking the rules of the game. And these dangers are formidable for the workers engaged in FIFA business operations, not only in tournament host countries, but also on FIFA apparel and other supply chains. Notably here, we are talking specifically about FIFA, but this perspective also has broader relevance for the weaknesses in non-binding corporate social responsibility. This research backs the need for binding due diligence laws, where businesses are legally accountable for the rights violations in their labor and product supply chains. Second, this research addresses the situation of migrant workers in Saudi Arabia, who fuel the economy, but who are held outside of the ambit of protection of labor rights and a pathway to citizenship. The kafala system of tied fixed-term employment binds workers to employers, heightening vulnerability to exploitation and abuse without a pathway to redress. As this research lays out, during the COVID-19 pandemic, Saudi Arabia further withdrew protections from migrant workers. It is worth noting that while the kafala system is prevalent across the Gulf countries as a regional paradigm for providing access to a flexible, low-wage workforce, tied fixed-term employment is also a dominant labor migration management model, part of our global system of trading the labor of migrant workers between countries, a form of trade that actually takes place at the WTO. So here, we are laying out a specific articulation of a problem and its dangers in Saudi Arabia, but the risks facing workers in tied fixed-term employment also speak to a global challenge. Third, and this is linked to the first two problems, absent binding and enforceable labor and human rights commitments from FIFA and other business actors, and for workers outside of the ambit of labor law protection, migrant workers, who make up more than a third of the population of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, require mechanisms to organize collectively to bring forward rights violations and defend their rights. Here, our research findings emphasize the critical importance of freedom of association, which goes hand in hand with freedom of expression and the right to collectively bargain. However, despite the 2021 labor reforms in Saudi Arabia, migrant workers are still prohibited from joining or forming unions. States that repress these rights cannot meet human rights due diligence requirements because freedom of association is a cornerstone right. The right to collective action against injustice is at the core of protecting all other labor rights. Notably, as you can read in this report, migrant workers in Saudi Arabia and all over the world still take collective action, especially in cases of workplace-wide wage theft, but at great risk to their personal security and livelihood. Where freedom of association is denied and worker and other dissenting voices are repressed, we do not have a barometer of justice, and this is where Equidem research comes in. This research was conducted by migrant worker investigators, members of my team, who worked in Saudi Arabia, who were either previously employed as migrant workers in the construction, hospitality, and maintenance sectors, or who are still employed in those sectors. They risk their livelihoods and lives to bring out the experiences of worker communities. For their own safety and security, they are not presenting the findings of this research, but it is their work that is at the core of this investigation, which includes in-depth, confidential, one-to-one interviews with 42 migrant workers conducted in two phases. First, from February 2020 to July 2021, in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, and then from May to December 2023. So what did we find? In the construction, hospitality, and maintenance sectors, Equidem found a pattern of rights violations that is particularly alarming because these rights violations are indicators of forced labor. Of the 42 workers we interviewed for this study, we found that 42% of migrant workers experience nationality-based discrimination, heightening their vulnerability to abuse. 70% were subjected to deceptive recruitment practices, including deception about the terms and conditions of their employment. 53% of the migrant workers we spoke to paid hefty recruitment fees, creating ongoing risks of debt bondage to repay recruitment debt. 12% of migrant workers had their passports confiscated by their employers. Workers also described abusive working conditions, including physical violence, intimidation, threats, and overwork. 7% of migrant workers that we spoke to experienced physical violence at work. 9% of the workers we spoke to faced health issues due to physical labor under prolonged exposure to scorching heat. 14% of the workers said they were required to complete unreasonable amounts of work with threats of penalty, including termination and deportation. Locking workers into these formations, these clusters of forced labor indicators, are significant barriers to seeking relief in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. 35% of migrant workers said that there were no adequate complaint mechanisms in place to file complaints at their workplaces. As we discussed in framing this presentation, workers have no avenue for redress if they don't have access to workplace complaints, and they're also systematically denied freedom of association. These indicators of forced labor individually are alarming, but when taken together, they can and do create forced labor conditions for migrant workers in Saudi Arabia. They also violate labor and human rights commitments under the ILO Forced Labor Convention, the Abolition of Forced Labor Convention, and the Protocol of 2014 to the Forced Labor Convention, all of which I'd like to note are actually enforced within the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. This raises another level of alarm, that even where the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has committed to enforcing international labor standards, the fundamental principles and rights at work at the ILO, they are falling short of upholding those obligations. So what must be done? Equidem calls upon FIFA to apply and enhance its binding and actionable commitments to address risk factors for labor and human rights violations as a condition of confirming Saudi Arabia's bid to host FIFA World Cup 2034. As we all know, there are no other bidders, right? What does that mean? Okay, but what can we do now? We can call for FIFA to require binding, actionable legal commitments to upholding FIFA's own standards. This investigation by Equidem into labor conditions in relevant sectors in Saudi Arabia follows on the heels of our investigation of hospitality and construction conditions in the lead up to the 2022 FIFA World Cup in Qatar. Despite extensive research on the hospitality and construction sectors, including testimony from 144 workers, engagement with FIFA in 2022, including providing names of every employer accused of exploitation, FIFA took no substantive action. In May 2023, Equidem also contacted FIFA regarding retaliation against workers by Stark Security, hired by FIFA to provide security for the 2022 FIFA World Cup in Qatar. You can read about these engagements in this report. Again, FIFA has taken no action to compensate the Stark Security workers. What can the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia do? Saudi Arabia cannot guarantee compliance with international human rights and labor standards without taking significant measures. This includes dismantling the kafala system, protecting freedom of association, and the protection of freedom of association in a context of Saudi Arabia is a long road. But Saudi Arabia can take immediate action by establishing a genuinely independent migrant worker center in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. KSA must also extend labor rights to migrant workers and address nationality-based discrimination, unfair hiring practices, workplace violence, exploitative wages, overwork, and exposure to occupational health and safety risks. Without these measures, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia's bid is completely invalid. For those of us from migration-sending countries, countries of origin also have a role to play in ensuring that migrant workers have the information they require to make informed decisions about their employment conditions prior to departure. This is particularly important for climate migrants. Details on these recommendations are available in our report. I hope you download it from the website and join Equidem in campaigning to hold FIFA accountable to its own human rights commitments. Thank you.
Thank you, Shikha, for that brief overview of the report findings. And Shikha is the Senior Policy and Innovation Officer for Equidem. I was also quite struck by you reminding us of the similar recommendations for Qatar. And I hope we will get into the panel discussions where we look at what do we learn, what do we accomplish, and how do we go forward for this bid that will be announced shortly, and what can we do prior to that confirmation of the World Cup bid by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. But at this moment, we are very fortunate to hear from an Equidem investigator, Martha Waithira, who is also former domestic migrant worker in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And we will also be joined by representatives from ALQST for Human Rights and also BWI. I think it's really important here that we look at some of the recommendations for going forward with the aim of what Mustafa said earlier, which is we can still nudge things in the direction that we had hoped to see, and to road, many of us who have been working on mega sporting events and business and human rights will remember that the first complaint was lodged by WBI in 2015 at the Swiss National Contact Point. And it took 2 years for FIFA to accept responsibility for the Qatar. So I think let's all look at these, but foremost, Martha, thank you for joining us today and for sharing your experiences with us. So without further ado, Martha, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Martha, a former migrant worker who works now in Equidem as a researcher and an investigator of abuses by employers against workers. I worked in Saudi Arabia from 2014 to 2017 as a domestic worker. I went to Saudi Arabia due to economic hardships, being a single mom at a tender age, to realize my dreams and taking care of my daughter and my siblings since we had no parents. I went through physical and emotional abuse in Saudi Arabia without getting any help from authorities, including Kenyan embassy, until I tricked my employer to let me go for a leave, promising to come back. I suffered from many challenges, among them working long hours, 15 to 18 hours a day without lunch break or even enough time to rest, lack of proper nutrition, insufficient food provision. I could only survive with Arabic bread, which is known as hobos, and strong tea, illegal deduction of salary, especially when allegations of breaking utensils arose, no day off, despite it being written on my contract. Sexual harassment was the order of the day from my male employer. He could come back in the house, he could walk around the house naked, and he could touch me in appropriate manner. It is important to note that even when I reached out to fellow migrant workers through WhatsApp groups for advice or help, they seemed to be facing the same challenges as me, and some worse. Rights violation include passport being taken away and never being provided with an Ikama, that is identity card, and never been provided with medical insurance card, which was taken away from me immediately on arrival to Saudi Arabia. Salary deduction, lack of freedom of speech, my opinion or complaints were not considered. Every time I could raise a complaint, I was told to shut up and that my employer paid a lot of money for me to go to work in Saudi Arabia. So I will do what they want me to do, not what I want. Lack of freedom of movement. The far I could go, it's outside the gates to throw garbage. Lack of freedom of movement. These challenges impacted me seriously. Fear being one of them. I lived in fear of being raped and expressing myself, even after coming back to Kenya due to flashbacks of terrible situation I went through. Trauma, lack of enough sleep, and low self-esteem because I never had the courage to share my story with anybody. Health-wise, back pain, consistent headache due to lack of enough sleep and working for long hours and standing for long hours led my feet to feet swollen. My feet were swollen until I could have enough time to rest. Now, I am an investigator for Equidem, shining light on other workers and survivors who find themselves in the same desolate place I once was. I am among many working tirelessly to ensure workers' rights, migrant rights, and women's rights are respected. That's why I am speaking here today. If Saudi Arabia hosts World Cup 2034, workers will leave their homes with the hope of improving their lives and those of their families. I am here to make sure they don't find themselves in quicksand. My worries with Saudi Arabia potentially hosting the World Cup 2034. No prescribed minimum wage, thus chances of underpaying migrant workers is high. Access to justice for workers in the respective labor code should be made more accessible to workers, lodge complaints. Occupational health and service regulation should be restrictedly adhered to during work due to harsh weather conditions during summer to protect workers from harm. Human rights organizations should be allowed to set base in Saudi Arabia and allow to talk to workers to know their challenges and address them through stakeholders meetings. A commitment of reforming the labor laws and respect to workers' rights should be preconditioned by FIFA before awarding the hosting rights. Implementation of existing laws should be a priority with clear timelines. Workers should be allowed to organize, and sensitization on how to access justice in case of violation should be prioritized. Establish labor offices in the country of destination and improve the capacity of the offices, not only having labor office, but enough to go around and do inspections. They can be able to meet with the Ministry of Labor often and discuss matters of migrant workers. Develop Migrant Resources Center professionals to be there for counseling. If Saudi Arabia does not make drastic efforts to stop the abuse of migrant workers, which is already widespread in Saudi Arabia, another World Cup tournament could be tainted with suffering and exploitation. My final call to FIFA is, following their own experience in Qatar 2022, they should try to improve the accountability by their contractors on how they treat workers. Violators should not be awarded any contract because they will continue to mistreat workers. Fair play should not only be to the sport, but it should apply to thousands of backroom migrant workers. who work hard to deliver the infrastructure to be used by FIFA. Thank you. Back to you, Bonnie.
Martha, thank you so much for your work now as an Equidem investigator, in your words, shining light on labor abuses. And thank you also for sharing your personal stories with us. They're so powerful, speaking of your motivations for why you decided to migrate and also your experiences there. We tend to think of forced labor indicators because those are the list of indicators of the ILO. And it always moves me to the core when I hear the stories behind them. You speak of, sexual, physical violence, intimidation. You speak of overtime. You speak of the sense of isolation and freedom restrictions. And you also paint such a powerful human story for why remedy is so important. These channels that the report is asking for, what does it do to a worker when there are seemingly no complaint mechanism and the sense of isolation that can ensue? I was reminded when you said headaches, right? It just reminded me of one of the many worker testimonies in the report, also talking about headaches associated with the scorching heat of working in the construction sector. And I think we will go back to that. And I hope that theme comes up more in the panel discussion about how we look at climate change and the vulnerability factors that it places on migrant workers. Thank you so much for that. Thank you, Martha. So without further delay, unfortunately, the General Secretary of the Building and Woodworkers International, Ambet Yuson, wasn't able to join us in person today. But he took the time out to record a video message that he could share with us, all of us today on the call. So over to you, Ambet.
My name is Ambet Yuson. I'm the General Secretary of the Building and Woodworkers International. BWI is a global trade union representing the woodworkers, the construction workers, building materials, and forestry workers in 130 countries. I am thrilled by the launch of Equidem's crucial report, Broken Promises for Labor in Saudi Arabia and the Fast Track World Cup bid. This report shines a spot on the harsh reality faced by the migrant workers in Saudi Arabia's hospitality, maintenance, and construction sectors. This report reveals severe labor and human rights violation, including workplace violence and forced labor. Equidem's report is timely, especially as Saudi bids to host the 2034 World Cup. Despite FIFA's requirement that all bidding countries must uphold to international human standard, Saudi Arabia's systematic labor abuse remain a stark contradiction to this commitment. Earlier this month, June 5, 2024, BWI filed a complaint with the International Labor Organization ILO on forced labor against Saudi Arabia, highlighting severe human rights abuses, particularly in the construction sector. Wage theft affecting an estimated 21,000 construction workers. They have been waiting for 8 years now, waiting for their wages to be paid. We have interviewed, we have received testimonies of construction workers who have suffered abuses for more than a decade. Their passports are confiscated. 85% of the workers we interviewed were victims of that bondage. Many have, have been manipulated and have been taken advantage by illegal recruitment agencies. In Saudi Arabia, there is no free trade unions. There is no trade unions who can fight for the rights of migrant workers. The BWI complaint to ILO demands urgent action from FIFA and the international community. Before even considering Saudi Arabia's bid for the World Cup, FIFA must ensure that the country align its labor laws, its implementation mechanism with the international standard. If Saudi Arabia, a single bidder, secure the World Cup bid, FIFA should ensure strict human rights compliance and must ensure that it is included in the binding agreement with the host country. To Mustafa and all the Equidem's team, your ongoing work on human rights is critical, and I welcome the opportunity to unite our efforts to champion the rights of workers and hold those in power accountable. Together, we can strive for a better future where promises are kept and human dignity is upheld. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambet Yuson, the General Secretary of BWI. The next panelist we have, and I have the pleasure of introducing, is Lina Alhathloul. She is the head of monitoring advocacy for ALQST for human rights. And their mission is to document the human rights situation and also to promote human rights in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Lina, it's a hard job to follow the video, but can you speak to us about the report findings so far and how that sits in the context of all that you're working on for better promotion of human rights in Saudi Arabia? Can you also look at that sense of fair play that Martha alluded to, not only on the field, but also off the field for the workers who make the World Cup possible? Thank you, Lina.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Bonnie. And thank you for inviting me. And thank you to the Equidem team really for your important work. I invite everyone to read the report. I think I also need to personally thank Martha for your courage. Really, it was heartbreaking, but thank you for being at the forefront of this. I know how difficult it must be. We're here and we stand in solidarity. So as said, I'm Lina Alhathloul. I'm head of monitoring and advocacy at ALQST for human rights. So we are a grassroots Saudi NGO. We are based in London because human rights work has been criminalized in the country and we cannot operate directly from the inside, unfortunately. So today I'll be speaking as a Saudi citizen at a Saudi organization. And I'll be focusing on FIFA, Saudi investment in sports, and human rights. I am not an expert in migrant workers. I focus on Saudi Arabia, mainly on political prisoners and freedom of association, expression, assembly. At ALQST, we have been following Saudi Arabia's involvement in sports closely. And as Saudi citizens, we do believe that football can be a powerful catalyst for positive change in our societies, as long as the football industry makes a universal commitment to human rights and lives up to its responsibility to ensure safe environments to work, play, and enjoy the sports. So how are FIFA and Saudi Arabia living up to these expectations? And how, if possible, can we use this opportunity to enhance the respect of fundamental human rights in Saudi Arabia? In October 2023, Saudi Arabia announced its intention to bid as the sole host for the 2034 FIFA Men's World Cup, just hours after the FIFA Council unexpectedly revealed that the bidding process would commence within a month. So we see that from the outset, the process lacked transparency, and efforts to gather more information about the bid were challenging. Notably, FIFA President Gianni Infantino visited Saudi Arabia in 2021 and 2022, praising the country and stating that the world should come to see what was happening there. Infantino's stance contrasts what FIFA's World Cup hosting requirements, which mandate, amongst other things, that bidding countries must first demonstrate how they will respect international standards on freedom of expression, peaceful assembly, and association. Also, according to the UN guiding principles, FIFA's human rights responsibilities include conducting ongoing human rights due diligence to identify, prevent, mitigate, and address impacts on all human rights. And key human rights elements in the World Cup bidding process include inclusion of stakeholder engagement in developing the human rights strategy. So, at the core of the subject here is to know how FIFA will do its due diligence. To conduct human rights due diligence, you need data and information about the country. Who is FIFA reaching out to for this? It certainly isn't doing that on the ground in Saudi Arabia, where human rights organizations are forbidden and human rights work is criminalized. The Saudi Basic Law of Governments lacks explicit provisions on the right to freedom of association, and no national legislation protects the right to peaceful assembly. It is even criminalized, as the anti-terrorism law contains vague words which are broadly interpreted and used to charge and sentence freedom of speech and assembly. Dr. Mohammed Al-Qahtani, Saudi Arabia's most prominent human rights defender, who tried to establish this first civil and political rights association more than 10 years ago, has been forcibly disappeared since his sentence ended. He could have been the right stakeholder to develop the human rights strategy, but will FIFA ask about him? Not only are the people who are the most knowledgeable about the subject muzzled in the country, Saudi Arabia is curtailing the right to free speech even in football stadiums. In fact, supporters of Al-Safa Football Club were charged and sentenced under Saudi Arabia's notorious anti-cybercrime law for chants at a recent match, which the authorities deemed sectarian. This act of repression, at a time when the authorities are investing heavily to promote sports and tourism, highlights the appalling discrepancy between the actions of the Saudi authorities and its official narrative of liberalization and promotion of human rights. We have documented that case of the supporters. And again, the lack of transparency is appalling. Documentation in Saudi Arabia has become a strenuous work as trials are held behind closed doors, contacting human rights organizations is a crime, and the government using all sorts of surveillance technologies to deter any critical voice, which unfortunately led to a high level of self-censorship in the country. If FIFA is not carrying out due diligence on the ground, itself concerning enough, it should at the very least consult stakeholders outside. As part of the World Cup process, a third-party company chosen by Saudi will carry out a supposed independent assessment of the human rights risk in the country, which FIFA will then evaluate. FIFA insisted that NGOs would be consulted in the process, but organizations like ALQST and even Amnesty have so far been ignored, and time is running out. Will FIFA monitor and push to protect free speech directly linked to acts in stadiums? And will the World Cup be an opportunity for positive change? The repression in Saudi Arabia is deep and entrenched, but the event could contribute to positive change only if the human rights requirements are fully met. While there might be announcement and promises leading up to the World Cup, both FIFA and Saudi Arabia must demonstrate their genuine commitment to respecting human rights. In fact, despite claims of reform, Amnesty International's 2024 analysis of a leaked draft of penal code shows little hope for positive change, as the draft would further entrench the criminalization of the rights to freedom of expression, thought, and religion, and fail to protect the right to peaceful assembly. To conclude, to show its honest and genuine willingness to respect its human rights engagement, FIFA should ensure that the many risks associated with the bid are fully addressed. This would entail, amongst more, conditioning the grant to releasing all political prisoners ahead of the event, lifting all restrictions, including travel bans on human rights defenders and their families, decriminalizing freedom of association and assembly, and allowing human rights organizations to operate freely without fear of defamation, prosecution, or reprisal. Without this, rights of women, migrant workers, minorities, and the rule of law cannot be advanced, and any human rights strategy not taking into consideration the reality on the ground is only fulfilling a box-ticking exercise. I thank you all, and I'm happy to answer any question you may have. Thank you, Bonnie.
Thank you, Lina. Thank you, Lina, for framing the findings of this report within the broader context of the human rights situation and the challenges for Saudi Arabia. I was, struck by what you said, in painting this human rights picture for us. You ended your intervention on a note that this could be a chance for positive change for the human rights situation for Saudi Arabia. And this was also the note that was echoed in the report, which is FIFA should use all of its leverage as the keeper of the world's most prestigious and arguably most beautiful game as well for positive human rights change, positive change for the rights of migrant workers. So with that note, I see that we have some panel discussion questions already, but I would like all of us to think about what would that look like, knowing that some of the reforms that was promised for Qatar has not materialized. How do we go forward, given that the bid for Saudi Arabia right now is the only bid, right? And it's about to be confirmed. So let me just start the panel discussion with one question I think that has already been answered, but I think this is quite important on the topic of recruitment fees, which is a risk of forced labor, as we know. And there's a lot of global effort moving to a system of employer pays where migrant workers do not bear the cost of their recruitment, that all cost of recruitment is borne by their employers. So this question, it's from the audience member asking that the figures cited in the report of 53% of workers having paid recruitment fees seemed a bit low. How could we explain it? And is it related possibly to their job position? I see that it has already been answered by Shikha, but I thought, Shikha, perhaps I'll give you the floor for a minute and you can explain it in more detail. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is actually an excellent question. Thank you, Henriette. One of the dangers of a 10-minute presentation is that you can't really get into the nitty-gritties of methodology, right? And so what I just wanted to clarify, and perhaps should have done before sharing those numbers, is that we were not able to do the type of sampling that would make the numbers that I shared projective of the general situation of workers in KSA, but rather they reflect the particular sharings, the stories, the discussions that our team had with workers. Now, the way that the Equidem team works is that there are a set of issues that people are actually required, our investigators are asked to check into. But as I wrote in this note, the first phase of our investigation nearly got shut down by the outbreak of COVID-19. And at that point, accessing workers in locked down housing sites was pretty impossible for us to do. And so investigators at that point were encouraged to actually bring forward the issues that workers themselves wanted to speak about, and to really leave the questionnaire format behind. So I've written about that in more detail. I'd be happy to discuss the particular distribution of workers. A lot of that is in the methodology of the report, but hopefully that gives you a preliminary answer. I think that you're correct, that if we were able to actually execute a robust sampling frame across these sectors, we'd see a much higher percentage of workers who are paying recruitment fees. But this is just giving you a sense of the reports that we got back.
Thank you, Shikha. I also would like to quickly add that I think it's a dream of any social scientist working in this sector where we know there are risks of forced labor is to get perfect sampling, right? We're always chasing a better sampling, but it's so difficult. You speak about in the report of how difficult it was to get sampling. You have workers leaving their work sites, leaving their accommodation and making this quick call, right? At great personal risk of loss of livelihood, and speaking to you in great confidence. And you also took great care in your report to do things like anonymizing. And so I think we are working against an imperfect picture, but same thing as what Martha said, behind each number is a story of aspirations and perhaps promise and met, and then the wish for how to improve, how do we still nudge things. So do we have other questions for the panelists? No?
Am I allowed to ask questions?
Of course, Lina. Of course you can ask. I also have a few questions, so I can always ask. But go ahead, Lina.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bonnie. My question would be to Martha. Martha, have you tried complaining when you were in Saudi about the abuse, and maybe to which institutions, if so, and what were their response?
Thank you so much, Nina. No, I did not complain. I did not raise any complaint to anybody because I did not have any way to communicate, and I was restricted from getting out the house, so I did not have any way to reach out to any organization that could have helped me.
Yeah, that's terrible. Thank you.
Thank you, Lina, for your question. Do we have other open questions? Let's see. No, just a comment from Henrietta McCall. Thank you. That was a really good question. And I think, recruitment fee is one of those topics where there's so many details, right? And we can probe, and it's really, really live. But we have another question coming in, so I'll hold off on the question that I have. We have a question here on some of the best allies for exploited workers in Saudi Arabia will be the workers in countries where the right to organize exists. Equidem have uncovered horrendous working conditions in Noon, which sponsors Newcastle United. Do you have any plans to link up with trade unions in Newcastle to organize solidarity actions? So perhaps, can I direct this question perhaps best for Mustafa? Could you take this?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. And thank you to the person who asked that question. We obviously today haven't spoken about the other work that we did in collaboration with the New York Times around forced labor indicator practices for workers in the company Noon. It's a very big e-commerce company in Saudi Arabia. and is also one of the main sponsors for the Newcastle United Premier League football team. So what we found in that investigation is not just the kinds of practices that Martha has spoken about her own experiences, and Shikha in the research that we've done, but a really shocking betrayal of that club on its own site, talking about its modern slavery commitment to eliminate modern slavery, to be an ethical actor. And so without going into detail, we certainly are talking with activists and trade unions in the region and globally around promoting those findings, because to be really clear, we're not just about documenting bad practices. We're in the business of trying to actually make people's lives better. And what better opportunity, not just for the Premier League, not just for Newcastle United, but for Saudi Arabia to actually do good by people, because what we're talking about here is ultimately workers not being paid, workers being abused, workers doing large hours in the heat. And as we've heard today from all our speakers, the things that we're demanding, these are not stratospheric things. This is basic dignity for all human beings, the right to be yourself, the right to be rewarded for your hard work, and the right to live the life that you want. So certainly when it comes to Noon, and certainly when it comes to what we're doing in Saudi Arabia, that is something that we will be taking forward. And if I also can just say very quickly, Bonnie, what it also shows is what happens in Saudi Arabia should matter to everyone, because this is an authority that has huge overreach around the world. As Lina pointed to, activists from Saudi Arabia very courageously, like her, speaking about their situation, cannot openly speak from within their country, but also face risks outside the country. But also, what does it mean about FIFA, the world's largest sporting body, which makes billions of dollars every year? What does it say about Newcastle United when their business partners can literally get away with murder, with abuse, the worst kinds of violations? What kind of signal does it send to other people in the international community? So, what is happening right now in Saudi Arabia can be addressed. We're not talking about earth-shattering solutions. But number two is the failure to address them is something that all of us should be very, very concerned about.
Thank you, Mustafa, for the reply. And also, we're looking at freedom of association, right? This goes back to one of the key findings of the report. When you look at the limitations on freedom of association and the fact that no free collective bargaining exists in Saudi Arabia, that is a fundamental principle and rights at work of the ILO. And it also returns to what Martha so eloquently framed in her reply, which is the idea of fair play extending both on and off the field for the people who enjoy it, to watch this beautiful game. I missed the last World Cup because after doing the report launch, I didn't watch it. So I think this idea of all of us partaking in that game is important and central to the idea of fair play. So we have one more question asked by the audience, and I think this pegs on really well to your last reply, which is on the nature of this fast track bid, which is in your title of your report. Does corruption vibrate that was likely to have occurred during the bidding process, does that make it less likely that Saudi Arabia will actually be pressured by FIFA to reform, to put in the human rights due diligence that we're asking for? So let's see. Mustafa, would you take that again? Lina, perhaps?
I'm really happy to respond, but yeah, really keen to hear from Lina, Martha, and Shikha as well. Just to say briefly that, like any large multinational, there is a legitimate question around the capacity to monitor your value chain. There is such a huge operation. The human rights impacts are global. But what you're seeing with FIFA is quite the opposite of not really actually adequately trying to address it. What seems to have happened, whether by design or organically, is that they develop a system by which they will have consultation with human rights actors. And yet shamefully, they're not speaking to Lina and ALQST, to organizations like Amnesty International that have done that research. so that they will speak about, oh, it's such a complex issue. There's so many aspects to cover, but the proof is really in the pudding. And I think that they're actually failing on really, really basic requirements of due diligence, to the point that in the last World Cup in Qatar, that we saw that actually it was often the sponsors of the World Cup, other multinationals, that themselves often have a very poor human rights record, who are much more activated to addressing these issues because they were concerned about their reputation, I can imagine. So this is something to really, really emphasize, that you're going to hear from FIFA that it's trying to be a force for good, but the issues are challenging. But in reality, they don't have the political will to really address these issues. And around bribery, the thing that all of us are concerned about, we obviously haven't investigated that, but that if there is bribery happening, we have no evidence of it, that unfortunately the leadership of FIFA and its stakeholders have learned the lessons from the past leadership of FIFA being effectively prosecuted for corruption, and they've worked out strategies to circumvent scrutiny. And that's why we're seeing some perhaps questionable decisions being made, including having one bidder, Saudi Arabia, quite clearly not meeting the human rights requirements. So it's a really great question. And again, it goes to the point of, if that's how FIFA is acting, what message does it send to the rest of the business community, or the rest of the actors in the international system?
Yeah, I agree with everything Mustafa said, and maybe I'll just add to that. There is, of course, the reputation issue, but I think we should also add, more than this, is that FIFA has also to realize the fact that today it starts with Saudi Arabia, and it's so blatant, it is so obvious that we are ruining the game from the inside, not only because of reputational issues, but also because corruption will be so entrenched in football that, you know, you won't be able to recover all of these years where they've tried to build a game that is based on the rule of law, where, you know, they're just basically accepting to be corrupt to a point where everything will be, it is destroying the game. So I just think that, you know, it's good to think about human rights and, you know, convince them about the importance of human rights, but it's also counterproductive for them, and it will backfire on the game as well. So I think that's also, you know, something that FIFA and Infantino have to realize, that you know, his legacy in football will be known for, you know, maybe the start of the football not being based on the rule of law anymore.
Thank you, Lina. Shikha.
Yeah, I think just the last thing to add before moving on to the many other excellent questions is that FIFA has been being pressured to reform for quite some time, right? And so it's not just the corruption in this bid, but there's actually a structural problem with the fact that FIFA is putting forward real promises without any actionable mechanisms to keep those promises in place. Those mechanisms don't exist within FIFA. Even when you bring forward the names of employers who have perpetrated abuses, particular worker cases, even though they've had internal investigations within FIFA recommend that they have a compensation fund for all of the abuses that took place in Qatar, FIFA is not taking those action steps. So whether or not there's corruption in the Saudi bid, there is certainly a real sort of red washing or putting forward labor standards as a way of kind of holding off the labor and human rights community while really not taking any significant action to protect workers through its business operations. So there's one question about how do we call for FIFA to commit to actual fair play? And there's another question, whereas when FIFA and so many business actors don't, what are we going to do about it? How do we really push forward human rights due diligence? How do we really make sure we take up the types of suggestions in this call of having workers from countries where workers are unionized, working to defend the rights of workers in other places? How do we think about transnational solidarity in the absence of business accountability and in the absence of state enforcement? And I think these are some of the exciting conversations that we need to have and will hopefully continue to have from this space.
Thank you, Shikha, for that. And this is not the end. We're just at the beginning of live tracking the human rights situation in Saudi Arabia, you know, with respect to this World Cup, but also, as Lina said, more broadly in the overall context of the human rights situation in the kingdom. We had some follow-up questions on the issue of bribery and the perception of greed and money, a long fee for corruption in Saudi Arabia. So, Alan, if you don't mind, I'm going to try to park that for a minute and go to the one on this question. It's too bad that Ambet is not here to join us today, but the question from one of our participants is, what were the first reactions of the Saudi government following the BWI complaint through the IOO complaint mechanism? Can we speak to that? Does anyone know? Because it's fairly recent. It was only submitted earlier this month.
Absolutely, Bonnie. I mean, I can speak briefly to say that I had the fortune or misfortune to be with Ambet and BWI in Geneva when they filed that complaint. And let's just say that it took incredible courage for them to do that. And without going into detail, there was a lot of pressure on them not to file that complaint. And so, as far as I'm aware, Ambet and BWI, we don't speak on behalf of them at all. But as far as we know, there hasn't been any formal response by the Saudi authorities. But I think that it is very telling that both there's been a lot of pressure on them, but there is clearly a lot of fear about this complaint and the kind of reverberations that this can have. You know, it's something quite surreal to be in a place like the ILO building, the UN building in Geneva, talking about labor rights. And then the moment that a trade union actually talks about, you know, punishment for not respecting them, then there's a lot of invisible talk. So there hasn't been any formal response as far as we know, but it's a very courageous step. And I would really urge everyone to support the BWI and the trade union movement to give their voice for workers in Saudi Arabia. And just finally to say, whilst the BWI complaint is about mostly migrant workers, there is a very strong acknowledgement in the actual complaint and more broadly by the trade union movement that all workers in Saudi Arabia facing human rights issues, including Saudis, who are a largely working population. So it's a great question.
Thank you, Mustafa. You know, one of the key readings in any class on business and human rights is the BWI complaint to the National Contact Point 2015 against FIFA. You know, important reference as well. Time is running out, but we have two excellent questions. So I would like to direct, if you don't mind, we're just running a little bit over time, but we have a great question here on the State Department report on human rights abuses in Saudi Arabia, and whether or not there have been improvements taken against the kafala system, saying that some actions against abuses under the kafala system but have been only partially implemented. Are we aware of any improvements? And then we have one more question that's directed to Martha, and I would like, if possible, for us to conclude on that question for Martha, so you can have the last word. But if I may, Shikha, would you like to take a question on whether or not the kafala system has seen any improvements in Saudi Arabia?
Sure. Actually, I think I'd prefer to pass that to Mustafa, if that's all right. It's an area that he's been working on for many years.
Sure, yeah, and I'm happy to speak briefly about it. So in 2021, Saudi Arabia actually, new labor reforms entered into force in Saudi Arabia that were the country's attempt to try to address aspects of its kafala sponsorship employment system for foreign workers that would create the risk of forced labor. So there were attempts to reduce the requirement for workers to seek permission to change from their employer to change jobs on the back of also having to seek permission to leave the country, to also provide some basic minimum standards for protection. So in terms of, and recently this year, there's also been legal change to recognize the rights of domestic workers under the labor law system. So in formal senses, there have been some reforms that have taken place. It's always very difficult to see in practice how these reforms have actually been implemented, but our data shows very clearly that there is a problem with a lack of implementation, but there's also a broader point, which is that the reforms don't go far enough because workers can't organize, and because beyond the laws, there are practices undergirded by the fact that employers have phenomenal power over their workforce, that Saudi Arabia, the workplace, has significant discrimination and persecution in it on the basis of nationality and race, and of course other factors, that really those reforms haven't gone far enough. And that's really a point that we'd really stress actually to the US government with its annual report. It's a really, really critical element of accountability and shedding a light on the situation in Saudi Arabia. You know, the United States is the primary ally of Saudi Arabia. So when it comes to labor rights and of course human rights, we really urge them to play that role in holding them accountable. But as far as we can tell, as challenging as it is, those reforms really have not gone far enough.
Thank you, Mustafa. I would like to ask Martha this wonderful final question from the audience. You know, gratitude from the audience, Martha, for sharing your story. And here's a question on whether or not Harry Kane, the captain of the English football team, had wanted to, you know, can we use these type of platforms to advocate for better migrant rights protection? Also, has Harry Kane using his platform to raise awareness, and what could these type of platforms, how can we leverage that to ask for better conditions in Saudi Arabia? So can I just have your final thoughts on what, Martha, what would you like to see from this World Cup bid?
Okay, thank you so much, Bonnie. If I can say that nothing has really changed since I was there from 2014, it's now 10 years down the line and nothing has changed. The salary is the same, working conditions is the same, mistreatment is the same. People are coming back to their countries even dead. So nothing has really changed since up to date. Thank you.
Thank you, Martha. Change, improvement. 1 hour is not enough time to dig out the nuggets of what you found. Another thing that we didn't have the chance to get to was heat stress. You know, climate change and this intersection with the added vulnerability on the workers in the sectors of employment that you mentioned. But I think we're a little bit over time. So please, I urge all of you to read the full report in its entirety. You can download it from the Equidem website, follow Equidem, and you can also watch this recording later. But without further ado, I think it's time perhaps we conclude, right? Unless anyone has anything to add. We can go on for another hour, I think. But let me conclude by thanking all the speakers and all the panelists today for talking to us about the findings of the report and what they hope to see from this World Cup bid. I thanked Ambet Yuson, the General Secretary of BWI, for recording the video. I thank Lina, Alhathloul, who spoke to us about the human rights challenges faced by the kingdom. Martha, thank you. And the Equidem research team led by Shikha and Mustafa. I would also like to quickly thank the team that you don't see, but whose support in the background has made all this possible. Jason, Deepika, Ron, and Jeffrey from Equidem. And also thank you, translator Rashid, for patiently walking us through the various back and forth between the audience and us. So please read the full report and please stay engaged with us as we continue the live human rights tracking of information coming out of Saudi Arabia concerning the World Cup. Thank you, everyone. And until next time.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.